here, they often talk about Genesis and they talk about the whole story of the Bible. I think that's wonderful. And I've really come to like the Bible Project. Who knows the Bible Project? Nobody knows the Bible Project? Okay. I'll tell you about the Bible Project because you can check it up on YouTube anytime you like. It's a couple of men, they're theologians, they made these short animated videos. They're only about 6 or 7 minutes long. They have one on every book of the Bible, do amazing outlines, they do amazing themes like justice, atonement, love, and every one of them they include the story of the Bible very quickly. So the story of the Bible, as we know, God created a beautiful world. He made Adam, but Adam was a representative of all of us, and when he sinned, we all fell into sin, right? And so there was a problem, we were separated from God, and God wanted to bring us back. But first of all, he chose a race, he chose Abraham, he created a nation, and he put laws within them so that they could follow God and have fellowship with God, and God was going to dwell in their midst, and they were to be a light to the nations. But we know they failed. And so God sent Jesus to become the representative of the human race to die for us. And I think Zay quoted this once, and it's a wonderful quote, St. Augustine apparently, the new is in the old concealed, the old is in the new revealed. And I think really to get an appreciation of the Old Testament, we need the new. Once we understand the new, we understand the old much better. And we know that Jesus preached from the law and the prophets, right? When he talked to the disciples on the road of Emmaus, he told them all about himself from the law and the prophets. He didn't have the New Testament. Of course, he was the New Testament, right? And Paul and the writer of the Hebrews, they preached from the law, the prophets, and the poems. So it's really important that we enjoy the Old Testament, but Leviticus isn't really our favourite book. It's not my favourite book, I must say, because so much about the sacrifice and this one and that one, they all seem to be the same. But this month we're studying Jesus as a high priest, and part of the priestly duty was to offer sacrifices. And I think Shagan, is Shagan here? No, Shagan tells us, I'm sure it's him, but maybe others, that Jesus is in every verse, every book of the Bible. And when it comes to Leviticus, it's Jesus, the great high priest. But Jesus is also the perfect sacrifice. So today we're going to look at some of the sacrifices in brief. I've listened to some sermons, I've read some stuff, and of course if you're a theologian, if you're a Hebrew scholar, you can talk for an hour on each one. And forgive me if I get it wrong, but I'm going to try. So the Bible says that the Old Testament is just a shadow of what's to come, but the substance is of Jesus. So the Old Testament is always pointing towards Jesus. Next slide, please. And we know that there are many types in the Old Testament. For example, Joseph, David, places, could be Jerusalem, could be the Promised Land, things, the articles in the tabernacle and the temple, the feast, the Passover, Pentecost, first fruits, whatever, and the institutions. So today we're going to look at the sacrifices. So, first of all, Hebrews and Leviticus. The book of Hebrews seems to be written to Jewish believers who knew the Pentateuch very well. And basically, one of the things it's doing is it compares the Old Covenant with the New Covenant. The Old Covenant was imperfect, and that's why God brought in the New Covenant. But the Old Covenant was a system whereby if we wanted to get close to God, there had to be a sacrifice of an animal. And of course, when Jesus came, he sacrificed himself, and his sacrifice was so perfect that no sacrifice needed to be made again. So it shows how Jesus is our great high priest and also the perfect sacrifice for sin. It was his blood that was shed on behalf of humanity in order to redeem us. But to understand Hebrews, we need to be familiar with Leviticus and some of the other books in the Old Testament. So let's go on. Okay, sorry if it's a bit small, but I've just summarised the 5 types of offerings between Leviticus chapter 1 and Leviticus chapter 7, there are 5 main offerings, but there's different subparts to each one. Sometimes it says, okay, you can bring a male cow or whatever, bull, I don't know, or you can bring a sheep, or you can bring this, or you can bring that, depending on how rich or how much money you've got. Or there might be different sacrifices depending on who you are, whether you're a common person, a priest, a tribe, whatever. But there are 5 main sacrifices, and Jesus can be seen in every one of them. And I think it's really good for us to look at this, because apart from anything else, it's going to give us a greater appreciation of the communion table. When you take communion, you're going to be able to say more than, thank you that you died for me. You're going to say more than, I love you, Jesus. Because you'll be able to say, oh, thank you that you did this, and you did this, and you did this. Okay, so let's, can we go back to that slide? I think we're onto a picture. Okay, so I've got 2 slides of pictures of the tabernacle. One's just a model. It'll come in a minute. It might not be, I don't know if it's exactly portioned. I think sometimes I've had pictures. Have we lost power altogether? Okay, never mind. Most of you, I think, probably are familiar with the tabernacle of Moses, right? But when there was a big courtyard. Oh, here we go. And the first thing you do when you go in the gate is there's this huge brazen altar where they burnt the animal sacrifices. So, and then the priests, of course, then there's the laver, and then only the priest could go into the next part, and only one priest could go into, the high priest could go into the very holy place where God is. This is a model, so we don't see the glory of God, but of course, in the time of Israel, God dwelt over the most holy place. And the next one is again another model in the desert, but there's no people there, no tents. But you can imagine all the tents camped around there, and God is in the midst of his people. Now there's one thing, you could not approach God if you are unholy. And some of Leviticus is all about purification, about unclean, being ceremonially clean. If you were ceremonially unclean, you could not go anywhere near the tent. Okay, you had to go through a process and then offer a sacrifice. So God is there, and he's in the center of everything, just like we just sang, right? He's the center of everything. But now we can approach God much more easily than they could. Okay, so the first one we just read, the first part of the whole burnt offering, and I'm going to just summarize it. This one is for atonement for sin. Next slide. And with all of the sacrifices, we find that the animal had to have no blemish, had to be a perfect animal. And we know in 2 Peter, is it 2 Peter or 1 Peter? I think it might be 2 Peter. Did I get it wrong? 1 Peter, right? Okay. 1 Peter 1:19, we know that we're redeemed with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. So Jesus, of course, was spotless. He had no sin. He was the Son of God. He never sinned. So he alone could be the sacrifice for us. Now, when the person brought their sacrifice, this one was, the first 3 offerings were voluntary. They didn't have to do them, and they were also something that says they were a sweet savour to God. He brings it to the door of the tabernacle, and it says he shall put his hand on the head of their burnt offering. Okay, so he has to put his hand on the head of the animal. And that means the sin, the badness in him gets imputed to the animal. So it goes out of him into the animal. And then the animal has to suffer for what the man has done. The next thing, it says, it shall be accepted for him to make atonement. And then it says, he shall kill the animal. So can you imagine, I've sinned, I bought an animal. I don't know if the ladies had to do this. Hope not. I can't imagine ladies doing this. They had to kill the animal themselves, right? So it was a very bloody process. I can't imagine doing it without getting some blood on you, right? You were sprinkled with some of the blood. And it shows that we were partially responsible for putting Jesus to death. It wasn't just the chief priest, it wasn't just the devil. God had a part in it too, but we were responsible for his death because he died for us. So the person that bought the offering, he put his sin onto the animal, then he had to kill it. And then the priest took up the job to lay the burnt offering in pieces. I don't believe any bones were broken. And the whole thing was burnt, the whole offering, the whole animal was burnt, except I think the skin or the hide in this case. I think you read some of it in Leviticus 1, some of it might be in Leviticus 6 and 7. There's another part. The priest sprinkles the blood around the altar. The skin is removed and given to the priest, and all the animal is burnt on the altar. That's a picture of Jesus. You know, he gave his whole life to God. And he said, I came to do not my own will, but the Father's will. So Jesus' whole life was given to God as a burnt offering. And it was pleasing to God. It says, it was a sweet savour to God. He is satisfied. Now, if we look at Romans 8, verse 2 and 3, we get some other light on it. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of death, for what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh. So when the burnt offering is sacrificed, the sin is atoned for. That the fire from the fire is a fire of judgment, and Jesus didn't die. He died a cruel death, but he also took the wrath of God on him when he died. Something I don't think I can really fully appreciate. I don't know how we can appreciate what Jesus did for us, but he did that, and it was pleasing to God. Let's look at the next one. Is there more? 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 5, 21 and 22. It's mostly 21, should be 21. He has made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. So the sin went from the man into the sacrifice. And the hide that was kept, it could be a picture of the righteousness of that animal that was kept. So Jesus took our sin, but he gave us his righteousness. And that's an amazing parallel there. Isaiah 53 is a wonderful chapter that really sheds a lot of light on the death of Christ. And it talks about his satisfaction, I think. 11 and 12. God sees the travail of his soul and is satisfied. So I think God looks down on his Son and was satisfied with this. By his knowledge am I righteous. Okay, let's carry on. He poured out his soul unto death. He was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So Christ, when he died, he took the sin, not just of me, but also of the whole world. Okay, so we'll go on to the meal offering. So that was chapter 1 of Leviticus. Chapter 2 is all about the meal offering, which I think usually accompanies other sacrifices. Now, I might be wrong. You can do your own study. This is supposed to represent dedication and consecration. This is not a blood sacrifice. This is not an animal. It can come in different forms. There was flour, oil, salt, and frankincense was poured on it. But it could be baked in cakes. It could be fried. I don't know. There were different ways that were accepted. So it had these main ingredients. It had no yeast and no honey. Could be prepared in a number of different ways. We know the first part is offered on the fire again, but the priest was allowed to eat the rest. So the priest got some food because, he had to live off the sacrifices. Now the fine flour it talks about typifies the perfect and balanced character or nature of Christ in his life. So when Jesus lived on earth, he lived the most perfect balanced life. He wasn't easily ruffled, right? He just calm, loving, compassionate, just everything. He was the perfect human being that we will never be. But he wants us to be, right? He wants us to be like him. So this is the meal offering. So there's the flour, the oil, the Holy Spirit. The salt was a preservative, and it's also a picture of his covenant with us, his unfailing covenant. Frankincense, I think, is something that's pleasing to God. Yeast in the Bible represents sin, and of course Jesus had a sinless life, and he didn't need extra sweetener. Now, in John chapter 6, when Jesus talks about, I am the bread of life, I'm the bread that came down, he said, Moses gave you bread from heaven in the wilderness, but I am the bread that comes down from heaven to give life to the earth. He says we need to eat of this bread, we need to eat of his body. And when we take the communion table, we appreciate his life and death. After we consider his death, we can partake of him. So when we're taking communion, we're thinking, Jesus' sinless life was given for me. It was all burnt up on the altar for me. So a wonderful parallel there. Okay, the next one is the peace offering, which is Leviticus 3. And, it's not too long, Leviticus 3. It talks about reconciliation and fellowship. It's a voluntary offering, but maybe somebody felt out of sorts with God and he wanted to come into right relationship with God. Now it's similar to the burnt offering. The hand was again laid on the sacrifice, and of course we know that Jesus was sinless, and the punishment that brought us peace. So it's very similar. The punishment that brought us peace is upon him. Again, Isaiah 53 talks about Jesus giving us peace. The chastisement or punishment of our peace was upon him. And verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. The Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. So because Jesus took our sin, we could be reconciled to God. We have fellowship with God. So this peace offering, I think there's more on the next slide. The offerer kills the animal, the priest sprinkles the blood. Yes, next slide. This one's a little bit different because only the fat and kidneys seem to be burned on the altar, but the rest of the flesh is not burned. Some of it is given to the priest, and he waves it before the Lord, or heaves it before the Lord. The best parts go to the priest, and it seems like the person that offered the sacrifice is able to enjoy a meal. Okay, so for 1 or 2 days he can eat this food. So again, it reminds us when we take communion, we can partake of Christ, and he has reconciled us to God through his Son. He's brought us into fellowship with him. Colossians 1:20, I'll just look at that one. And having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things to himself, I say whether they be things in heaven or things on earth. It says, and you who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now have he reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable in his sight. So when Jesus died, he brought us together with God. He took away our sin and let us have fellowship with his Father. The other verse is Ephesians chapter 2, 14, 17, maybe from verse 13. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were sometimes afar off are made near by the blood of Christ, for he is our peace, who has made both one. And here it's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles becoming joined together. Let's go to verse 16. He might reconcile both to God in one body on the cross, having slain the enmity, He came and preached peace to you that were afar off, and to them that were near. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father.